with the message from last week about Ash, Lent, and Easter. We'll do a review to begin today, and then we'll go into some more content. We still have lots of slides to go. I don't know that we'll make it through this week even, but we'll see how that goes. So, in review, the apostles, what we learned last week was the apostles in the early churches kept Passover on Nisan 14. They always did that, and the biggest and best evidence from that was the big fight that Rome caused when they started changing the dates around. And the first thing they did was they changed the date to the following Sunday. So the Sunday that followed Passover was the date that they chose. So they're still kind of linked to Passover that way. And we looked at the reasons for that. Why did they do that? What were the forces in their society that was causing them to make these changes? And we saw some things. We don't know the cause, of course. We only can look at the forces involved. But we know that all Romans didn't like Jews. And that was not just true of all Romans. It was also true of Christians who were Romans. They didn't like Jews. And so they didn't really want to be like them or be associated with them or be seen to be Jews. And so they had a problem that way that really motivated them to not look like Jews. And they also saw that Sunday was the day of the new cool god Sol Invictus, and he was becoming much more popular than Saturn had been at that time. And so that's another reason why they would have wanted to move things to Sunday. And they believed that Jesus was resurrected on Sunday, and so there's another support for moving things to Sunday. And another part of it, we talked about the politics of it. They wanted to force their will on other churches. And we'll dig into that whole thing a little bit more today than we did last week about the fights that went on between the Church of Rome and the other sees that we talked about last week. But they really wanted to be seen as the most powerful and the leader. And sometimes it seemed like they would make changes just to try to force others to do their will. And so those forces all seem to be things that would have been applied to them. How they responded and what they did and why they did is not entirely clear. They certainly never wrote about it. So then we talked about a man called Polycarp. He was the last living man who had actually worked with and studied under apostles. And so he had a lot of credibility because of that. People respected his opinion on things. He was a theologian of his time and taught people about problems they're having in their churches, and he wrote epistles to churches, much as the other apostles had done. And so he was a very respected man in most of the churches, but not so much in Rome. And we saw that he went to Rome. That happened about 155 AD. And part of the reason that he went there was the trouble that Rome was having keeping out false doctrines, keeping false doctrines from getting into the church. And I want you to think about that now as we go through the rest of this review. Ask yourself the question, why was it that Rome was having trouble keeping bad teachings out? Because we've seen that was their past, and we see that even today that they have that same problem. And so keep that in mind as we go through this, and we'll have a bit of a discussion about that once we get past the review. So Polycarp went to Rome, and he told the Bishop of Rome that this date that they had chosen was wrong, and he said that all of the apostles kept Nisan 14 and had never changed from that. And the Bishop of Rome, it seemed like he had said, yeah, we know that that's the truth, but this is our tradition, and I couldn't possibly stop it. Now, of course, he had the authority to do it. He could have changed it. He just didn't want to change it. So the power politics is involved here again. So this is the Bishop of Rome. If he makes a change because an Eastern bishop tells him to make a change, then he doesn't look as powerful as he wants to look. And so he's kind of locked himself in here. He can't make this change that he should make because it'll make him look weak, weaker than the Eastern Church bishop. So he isn't going to do it for that reason as well as others. He just doesn't want to. And so this caused a big split between Rome and the Antioch See that we talked about. And we'll see those on a map again later on. And after that, things only got worse. So Polycarp returns from Rome, and he's caught by the forces of Rome and executed as an atheist. We talked about that he was called an atheist because he didn't subscribe to any of the approved religions. Rome declared him, the Church of Rome declared him to be a saint, even though they had ignored him in life. So he came to tell them that they were doing wrong. They ignored him. They still made him a saint, which seems strange. So after this, Rome changes the date again, and they now move Resurrection Sunday, or they call it Resurrection Sunday, and they give it a brand new date, which is the current date that we have for Easter. And as part of that, they send a threatening letter to the Church of Antioch, the See of Antioch, and telling them that they need to comply with this change, or the Pope in Rome is going to excommunicate them. This happened a lot. Popes were frequently, there were many times when there was more than one pope, and they would excommunicate each other. So, yeah, and somehow they gave themselves this power to excommunicate. Yeah. So in any case, what's happened here is their tradition, as they called it, has now become a requirement for others. They think that everybody should be following their tradition. And traditions generally do that. But the Church of Rome has also had a lot of traditions building up, and traditions that overwrite what the Bible says. And so that's a really bad thing. Jesus ran into that same thing in his time, that the church there had adopted traditions that were against what the Bible said. And so the same thing has happened here in Rome, and they're now forcing it on other people. So next we saw Polycrates, responding to that, and to that threat from Rome that they have to change the date or else they're going to be excommunicated. And in his response that we look through in detail, he begins by implying that the Bishop of Rome is adding and taking away from the Bible. And we talked about that. The Bible warns about doing that. It says don't add or take away, don't go to the left, don't go to the right. There's a lot of words in the Bible talking about making any changes to what you see in the Bible. So he says that he implies that the Bishop of Rome is doing that. And then he continues on by saying that his family itself has a long lineage of bishops, and that there were many other bishops with him who were helping him write this letter. And he names some of the former great elders of the Eastern Church, and talks about them all being people who walked in the Holy Spirit. He says, of all of these people, all these bishops that have been in the church, all of the apostles that started the church, all of that sort of stuff, none of them had ever kept Passover on a different date. They'd always kept the Nisan 14 date. And he continues on by finishing and saying he's not afraid of their threat of excommunication. He doesn't care about that. Right at the very end, he makes another implication. He implies that the Bishop of Rome is not governing his life by the Lord Jesus because of what they're doing. So he kind of fires back in his response. And the Bishop of Rome is just absolutely livid with this. And he wants to excommunicate them, but he knows that it would mean nothing to them. He just doesn't have the power to enforce an excommunication there. Rome doesn't have that much power yet. They will later on. So what he does do is he begins building churches, Roman churches, in the east part, in the Antioch part, where the church is that has rejected him. And these churches begin to pull people away from the Eastern churches, and they also start to persecute the people of the Eastern churches, and making it really hard for them to continue to live. So after that, we also looked at the Council of Nicaea right near the end of our study, and that was called in 313 AD to address a whole bunch of theological problems, not just this date of Passover. Most of the attendees, though, by this time are Romanized bishops. Rome has really been able to grow as a church, and so most of the bishops that are out there are bishops that came from the Roman church, and they agree with the Roman church. So the council is kind of biased that way. Whatever Rome has said is what's going to be accepted, because there are so many Roman bishops. And so as a result, Rome's date for Resurrection Sunday is set as the standard for all Christianity, and it has remained that way since. And with what happens is with this is that Passover is replaced by Good Friday. So now, instead of what used to be Passover, we now have Resurrection Sunday and Good Friday 2 days before that. So it's not at all similar. The dates aren't even similar. This new date is not based on Passover at all. Although some people have argued that it never happens on the same day as Passover, and that was intentional in the way they chose the date. So Easter will never happen on the same day as Passover. And so that kind of shows an intent there not to look like Jews. So because of this Council of Nicaea decision, the Eastern Church splits off, and they say, we're not going to be part of this body anymore. We're going to do what we believe is right. And with that, the Church of Rome begins to really persecute them seriously, so badly that it's necessary for them to leave Roman territory and go outside of what Rome had conquered. and take the church out there. So they pretty much leave the geography that they're in. Some of them stay true and keep on with their teachings. And even to this day, there are some who remain from that church. But others fall for bad doctrines. And we saw Paul, when he was meeting with them out on his last missionary trip, he warned them about wolves coming in and tearing up the flock. And we see that did happen. Many of the people who left as part of the Eastern Church went after bad doctrines and got lost. Okay, so here's the map I was talking about. Let me get my laser pointer out here. And not just because it's cool. Hello, laser pointer. I don't see it. Okay, well, I'll have to tell you. Unfortunately, there's names. Okay, so in the beginning, there were 3 seas. I mentioned this last week. There was the Sea of Rome, there was the Sea of Antioch, and the Sea of Alexandria. And a sea is like a department or head of a department within an organization. So these seas were in charge of all of the Christian churches in their area. So the one in Rome was responsible for Rome and Greece and western from that. The one in Antioch was Asia Minor and things east of that. The one in Alexandria was responsible for the ones west of Alexandria and south of Alexandria. So those were the kind of the heads of the churches at that time in those 3 seas. Later on, 2 others were added. Constantinople was added as another see. And Jerusalem was added as a see as well, although it was a pile of rubble at the time, and really it was just a ceremonial post to call it a see. So anyway, with the Council of Nicaea decision in 313, the Eastern Church breaks off from that church body and no longer considers itself to be part of it. And later on, they are forced to go east geographically. So they actually are persecuted so much that they have to leave Asia Minor, which is below Constantinople on this map, which you can't see. Let me try a different pointer. Ah, there we are. That's a much better pointer. Okay, so the church, the Eastern Church, which is this area here, Asia Minor and Antioch, big parts of it move way out over here, and some exist there still to that date. As I told you, they kind of go in different ways.
Okay.
Yep.
When they move further east, what area more or less is it now?
That's getting into Arab countries that we know of now, Iran, Iraq. If you go that.
How do you spell the word sea?
S-E-E.
S-E-E.
Yeah, as though you saw something, but it's not that sea. So that's them. They leave the great body that they had been part of from the start. Then later, 150 years later, there's another council that gets together, and they're defining the nature of Jesus and who Jesus was in the sense of, was he God and man mixed together, and if so, how he was mixed together. And the council again made a very Roman decision. The Romans had their thumb on the scales for a lot of these decisions, and they had an interest here because it was necessary because they had already made Mary into the mother of God and therefore God herself. It was necessary for the nature of Jesus to be a certain way, and so they had their thumb on the scales of that decision about the nature of Jesus, and they made a decision that the church in Alexandria didn't agree with, and so they left the organization at that time. That's 451. But by this time, they are already partly polluted. The Eastern Church had rejected everything that the Roman Church was trying to change and hadn't ever gone along with it. But the Church of Alexandria had been a Romanized church for quite some time. And so when they left, they took a lot of the Roman things with them. And the only thing that they ever really rejected was that decision of that council. And then they kind of went on their own theological path. So they had some of that pollution from the Roman Church already, some of those ideas about Mary and other things that had come on early. So now another 600 years later, there's another big split caused by Rome. They start to make other changes to the theology that the Eastern Church, or the remnant of the Eastern Church, basically the Greek part of it, doesn't agree with. And this is one of those cases where there were 2 bishops who excommunicated each other. And so the Greek part in 1058 split off from the Roman part. So this is a really big split here. In the other splits, it had been smaller groups of churches, but now this is basically half of the church. Half of it is the Greek part, which is Greece here and everything kind of east from there. And then the Roman part is in here, in the western part, and this splits the church in half from what it was. So, one thing I was going to mention, this part down here is called the Coptic Church today. They still exist. They're the Egyptian church, you could call them, or Coptic is apparently the right word to use. And so they're still a Christian church there.
Stan, is the church in Ethiopia part of them?
I expect it would be. Yeah, I don't know that for sure, but it would just make sense that it would be. They were in that sea. So
I had heard from, I read from them that they believe that they started from the Ethiopian eunuch, that was converted in the book of Acts. And I'm not positive if that's true, but that's what they believe. Mm-hmm. And so they read the book of Enoch, including all the Bible itself. And they're keeping the Sabbath, so
yes,
and the commandments. So that's very interesting.
Well, yes, and I'm going to belabor that a little bit. When Rome finally got around to going up to Britain, which is off the map here, and faraway places like that, they found that there were already Christians there who were keeping the Sabbath, keeping the feasts, and which of course horrified Rome, and they made their best effort to make their lives hard until they stopped doing that. And that's the story everywhere. Is a lot of these faraway places that the apostles got to first, or people that the apostles had taught got to, can name the apostle that they came from, and also are Sabbath keeping. So what happens here with this big split in 1058 is there's a split geographically and basically on a line that kind of goes up from here. And everything to the east of that is now what we call the Orthodox churches. So there's Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, if you've heard of those, and others. And they use the word Orthodox, meaning that they are following the Bible. They are Orthodox, which is an implication against Rome that they weren't following the Bible. But they are more polluted. When they do that split, they throw away some of the last changes that Rome made, but they keep everything else that Rome had done before. So they're still doing the Passover on the new date, and still Mary is still a god, and a lot of things like that continue on with them. So they don't clean themselves out completely. They only throw away the last decision that they really didn't like from Rome. And so there's I'm bringing that up because it's important, because in 1517, when the Protestants split off, now in 1517 there still isn't an America, not yet. It's just 1492 was Columbus, and so it's just been discovered, but there really aren't any Christians there. So the Christian world for the western part is still Rome based, and all in that northern to western area from Rome, and the Protestant church, or the Protestant split that happens, isn't a geographic split like the others, where the Antioch church was a geographic area that split off and said this area is ours. What happens with the Protestant split is that it's brother versus brother in there. Half of the area is is Catholic, and half of it is Protestant, and that results in a very large fight where Catholics and Protestants are killing each other.
Now, by brothers, you mean actual brothers or just church brothers?
Church brothers. Well, no, actually, it would be real brothers too. Just as Jesus said, it would be brother against brother, father against son. That same kind of split happened there, because even within families, some of the families would be Catholic and some would split off and be Protestant. So, yeah, it became quite ugly. And that went on for, I'm trying to remember, but I think it was something like 100 years where they were really fighting hard and killing each other. And even later on, with Queen Mary in England, she did some things too. So that was later on. Anyway, but now we don't do that anymore. We've kind of gotten over that. So the Protestant churches, how polluted are they? Well, it varies, because the Protestant movement was an effort to move things back in time. They did it to different degrees. The Lutheran church, Luther really only had problems with a couple things that Rome was doing, and he didn't want to push things back any further than that. And so he was kind of like the other churches that had split off, the Eastern Church and others. They just wanted to get rid of that last decision that Rome made. And so he was like that too. He just wanted to get rid of these papal indulgences that gave you get free, get out of purgatory free card. So he just really wanted to stop that, and so he didn't really go anywhere in reforming Rome. In fact, he made a couple of steps further than he was comfortable with and recanted them later on. But other reformers really took it more seriously and tried to throw out things that Rome had done to a deeper level, and they threw out lots and lots of stuff. So that's some history and how things all happened geographically there. So I want to bring up a question that Pastor Joe brought up last week. If you aren't Catholic, what are you? And he says, we're not Protestant, and he's right. But what is the difference there? And so in North America, we really only think that there's one other choice. If you aren't a Catholic, then you must be a Protestant, because that's just the way they think. But we've seen from this map here and what happened in history that there were other groups that split off from the Roman Church. And the one that is probably best known is the Orthodox one. There are some Orthodox churches around here. And so we know of them, we know that they exist, but we know that we're not them for sure. And so all of these splitters that split off in the past were trying to move the clock back enough so they could be comfortable with the religion that they had been in. And so generally it was a decision by Rome that caused them to leave, and they just rolled back that decision but continued on the way they had been, that same path. And so the Protestant Reformation is really very similar to like that. It started out with Luther just wanting to make some particular changes and clean up something he didn't like, but it really got out of control, and it got on a roll and started moving, and lots of other reformers jumped in who wanted to do more than that. And some of them had some success in moving back what Rome had done. But like I said, some just weren't ready for that, and Luther was one of those. They couldn't go that far. And many of the congregations couldn't go that far either. If your church tries to move too fast for your congregation, you can lose your whole congregation. So there were struggles there as well. And because there were differences on what Rome had done wrong and how much that should be rolled back, there were different churches now, even today. There are some that are far, far away from the Catholic Church, and there are others that are just slightly off of Catholic. But there were a few people who, instead of trying to roll back what the Catholics had done, said, let's start over. We're going to just start with what does the Bible say, and we don't care what the Catholics did, and our foundation will be the Bible and nothing else. And our church is one of those. The Church of God, if you see them on some of those maps you can find on the web that show how churches are all linked together and how they all came from the Catholic Church, you'll see that this church is often in different places on that map, because you really can't categorize us as having come from Methodists or having come from Baptists, because we're really nothing like them. And so what we did, and some other churches have done the same thing since. The Messianic churches have done the same thing. They said, forget everybody else. What does the Bible say? We're going to do that instead. And so we aren't Protestant. We are people who went back to what the Bible said, and we're trying the best we can to live close to the Bible. And with that, of course, comes throwing out everything the Catholics did. But that's not really our concern. We don't relate ourselves to what the Catholics did. We don't see ourselves as reformers who are putting back things the way that the Catholic disturbed them. We are just going back to the Bible. Does that make some sense? Okay, so the question I had you thinking about, why did Rome have so much trouble keeping false teachings out? What do you think on that?
I think you mentioned it last week that that was just where everybody went.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody went to Rome. Every religion went to Rome, and so there were just so many different ideas being thrown around.
Yeah, that's a problem in many churches, even in our current time, is that if they don't make the effort, people will walk into church with ideas they got on the outside and start spreading those around inside of the church. That definitely happens. But I'm looking for something a little deeper.
I think part of the problem is that their culture in Rome was such that they were always conquering some country or some part of the world, and they would adopt whatever they had, for whatever reason. Why they would do that, I don't know. To me, it would make more sense to say, no, you're going to be like us. But no, they said, what are you doing over there? Oh, that sounds pretty good. Let's take that in too, So the Romans were a combination of so many different things that they adopted in there, and that's made it impossible to keep false teachings away.
Yeah, that's certainly part of it, and that's really linked to what you were saying. Is that
Well, the more, I guess, the more ideas you let in, the larger you can go with the church.
There
So
you-
if you go somewhere and you have this little, you have this tradition.
Right.
Well, if it means we can get 150,000 more people, okay, that sounds good. We'll let that in. And that also goes with, you told that incredible story last week about those people from South America that went and took their little idol.
Yep.
And some people threw it in the river, and then some people took it back out of the river. It's like, hey, we let this idol stay in the river. We may lose a few 100,000 people down there. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is getting to where I want to get to. That attitude, what is giving them that attitude that they want to take that thing out of the river and prop it back up and have people worship it again? What is in their hearts? What's going on inside of them that's causing this, do you think?
Paganism gets us in their heart too.
Well, fear. You could think of fear. Fear of what? Fear of losing people. Fear of not growing. Those are all parts of it. I think there's a deeper way to look at it. And the way I look at it is they lack humility. And you see that in many places with Rome. They see themselves as being greater than all the people they conquered. They see themselves and all their technology, which was pretty fancy at that time. They see themselves as being something very special. And that lack of humility becomes a lack of humility towards God. And they don't respect God anymore. And so because of that, they don't put in the effort to keep out these teachings. It takes effort to keep out false teachings. You need to be watchful because they sneak in all the time, and you have to have that respect for God and what God says in order to do that. And so, as I said, the Roman view of themselves was that they were the greatest country in the world. They had the greatest technology and the greatest government system, and they thought because of that, they are the greatest people in the world. And that shows up in early Christian writing from the Roman Church. And they had aspirations. They figured that they would be the greatest church in the world because they were the greatest people and the greatest country and all that sort of stuff. And so they were determined to build a great church. And a great church requires lots and lots of people. So what they had left out, of course, was God in all of this. It's, as Pastor told us about a month ago, I think, in his sermon, it is God who builds the church. But they weren't going to be happy with that. They wanted to build the church themselves. And the way you build a church yourself is exactly what you were saying. You accept people that you shouldn't be accepting. You allow doctrines to exist that shouldn't be allowed to exist. And without going into our history not long ago, we've seen that idea in there, in that if you keep doing that, you start allowing all sorts of things into the church, and pretty soon your church begins to wander away from the truth. And so the church that they built loved power and authority because that was the kind of people who built it. They compromised the message to increase the body count, and that's what you can do. If you want to have lots of people, you do a soft message that doesn't say anything bad or hurtful or doesn't threaten anybody, and you can build a big church on that. And we see over and over again that they value traditions over the Bible. Their ideas about things overrode the Bible in many places. And that again comes from their lack of respect for God. And they feared, and that Pachamama, I said it wrong last week. I said Papamama. It's Pachamama. I looked it up. Not that it matters to you, I suppose. But they have feared offending the Pachamama worshipers more than they feared offending God. And so they wanted to get that up because they were afraid that they would offend people, but they didn't seem to be cared about what God thought. What does God care about this idol? Well, God cares quite a bit about this idol. And so what God wanted wasn't their priority. And their priority was building this mega church is what they really wanted to do. And so one theme from Passover is inspect yourself. And there's a verse that actually talks about that at Passover time, you should be inspecting yourself to see if you have slipped away. And that's something that we need to do all the time because the world is full of false ideas and even now more than I've ever seen. Ideas in churches that are just crazy things, but people are picking them up and bringing them into the church. And so it takes effort to be watchful and to keep out bad influences.
You said that word paka something?
Pachamama.
A Nile, or what did you say?
Yeah, it's a fertility goddess from South America.
Sounds like Easter.
You know, the fertility goddess got into, yeah, we'll actually get to that in a minute, into Passover quite a bit, because it's of the season.
There's a lady that I work with, and she says she went to visit a non-denominational church that was very, very huge here in San Antonio. And she was curious, and she wasn't sure what their doctrine was, what they believed in. She said, well, what is your doctrine, you know? She was asking some people that greeted her because she was new.
Mm-hmm.
What is your doctrine? What do y'all believe in here? And they said, well, we believe in whatever you want to believe. Because, you know, we that's why we're non-denominational, because we believe everything everybody believes that comes.
Mm-hmm.
Because we believe that the only way to build a large church is a lot of compromise.
Yeah.
But she said, I found it odd that they would admit that. So that was kind of weird. I don't know if she ever went back again, though.
Yeah, and that is one way to build a big church, is to not criticize anybody, not say anything bad. Mm-hmm. And the result of that is that there are some churches where people go to the same church, same building, and they believe entirely different things about God, but they still say that they worship together. Really?
Yeah, they will say, you know, as long as you're Christian, you're accepted here.
Mm-hmm.
Without any saying what Christian, and they purposely refuse to define Christianity, because they just like, whatever you think being a Christian is, we're fine with that.
Very much the truth.
That's the attitude of a lot of churches nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit about backdating. The problem you run into as the early Catholic Church is that you've made changes to Passover, but you don't have any biblical basis for those changes you made. There's no way to justify that change. At this time, the Pope really isn't the authority figure that he soon becomes after this. And it isn't satisfactory to say, well, the Pope has the authority to do that, because the Pope didn't have that authority at that time. And so they wanted to do and did do some backdating, which is to say they put things into the Bible so it looked like they happened earlier than they really happened. And one of those comes from, you can see it in Corinthians 11:20, where it says the Lord's Supper. And the question there is, when you look at all of Christianity, they call it Passover. Well, actually, we'll see that the English and the German people don't. They call it Easter, but we'll look at that later. But everybody else in Christianity, every other language calls it Pascha. And in Spanish, that's the word that's used for Passover. And it means Passover in Aramaic. We also talked about Pesach being the Hebrew word. And so what we see in all Christianity is they don't call it the Lord's Supper, they call it Passover. And that's been from the very start. You see that in the earliest Christian writings, they called it Passover. And so it seems strange that you would see the Lord's Supper mentioned in 1 Corinthians, but nobody ever called it that until the 5th century. There's no Christian writers who used the words Lord's Supper until the 5th century. And so it appears that the Bible was backdated there. They created a brand new Greek word that had never been a Greek word before to do this. And this word means the Lord's, the possessive version of the word for Lord. And that's still not a Greek word. It only appears in Christian Greek writings and only after the 5th century. It's the Greek LXX, the Old Testament, doesn't contain this word. And so they created this new word to have this new concept that they were bringing in. And it appears twice in the New Testament. And that's the only 2 times that it appears. And so what happened there is it appears that they put this new concept in of creating something they called the Lord's Supper at that time, or by that time they were calling it. And that was written into the Bible as though it had been written by Paul himself. And so the word appears in one other place in the Old Testament or the New Testament, and that's in Revelation 1:10. And in that case, Sunday is referred to as the Lord's Day. So it appears that like it was used twice in the New Testament, but one to justify the changes they'd made to Passover, and once to just to hide the changes or to justify the changes that they had made to the Sabbath or were making to the Sabbath. That doesn't happen until 50 years later in 364 that they changed the Sabbath officially, although Rome had stopped keeping the Sabbath earlier than that. So those two references to that use that word both seem to be backdating ideas that the Catholic Church had come up with later and putting them into the Bible. That makes sense?
Well, what should we call it?
Well, we'll talk about the word Easter. You don't want to call it that one. That's really problematic. I don't think there's any reason you have to call it a particular word. If you want to call it the Lord's Day, that's fine. But what the word in the Bible is Passover. Use whatever feels good, but just not Easter.
When you say they backdated the Bible, you meant
They changed
later interpretations of the Bible.
Yeah,
Right.
but the Greek manuscripts are an ongoing thing. They have to be rewritten by copiers all the
And
time.
when they're rewritten, that's when you're saying they start
Right.
to use it. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, none of those manuscripts last very long, and our oldest manuscripts are not that old. They're like only 1,000 years old, something like that. So, okay, so how do we get from Resurrection Sunday to Easter Sunday? And with the earlier stuff, we have documentation from how Passover was changed, what the Roman Church did, and all of those things. Those are all recorded in history. But now we're going to get into an area of, well, I don't know. There's nearly no records of exactly how this all happened. And so we kind of put together the pieces that we have and try to understand it. What we do know, and everybody agrees on, the linguists, historians, everybody says that the name Easter comes from an Old English word, Eostre. We'll see that down below. And that came from Proto-Germanic. And so it was the name of a goddess that was in Old English, who was also formerly a goddess in Germany. And so this is going back a long ways. Old English is an English that if you heard it, you couldn't understand it. If you saw it written, you couldn't read it. It was that different from our English. And it came from German, which you couldn't understand, obviously. And so this goddess, for sure, is where that name Easter comes from. Where she came from is not clear. She wasn't primarily a fertility goddess, so it seems a little strange to have all these rabbits and eggs and spring things all associated. But she did have a spring feast that they celebrated. And the documentation is so poor that no one's really sure exactly how that was celebrated at that time. So yet we have these symbols of Easter that are all about spring and renewal and fertility and things like that. And it must have come from her, but nobody has any documentation to say that those things were ever really associated with her. So again, we're into history that isn't well documented. Her origin isn't clear. Where did she come from? A lot of people say that she came from Ishtar, which was a Babylonian goddess, and there's no real documentation for that. But the names are certainly similar. You could say that Ishtar is very similar to Easter, or Eostre, either way.
Stan,
Yeah.
I just remember something. I think Martha remembers this as well. There was a brother during the church conference that we went to some years ago. He was collecting money for Ishtar.
Really?
Yeah, you remember that one?
No.
Brother Wade Rose. He was collecting money for Ishtar, and I don't know. And some of us asked him, why Ishtar? Oh, that's just the name we're giving it, you know.
I thought it was Ishakar.
I don't know. I remember Ishtar.
I don't remember Ishakar.
That would be a problem. If it's Issachar, that's one of the tribal names, so that's not so bad. But
That's why I was asking her, because she probably remembered it
No,
better
it
than I
wasn't
do.
Ishtar, it was Ishakar.
That was very close to that, so that was kind of
That is
confusing.
Why are they collecting money for Issachar?
even that's strange too.
Ishakar.
Ishakar.
So anyway, we do know that this Easter name came from this Germanic goddess, but where she came from, we don't know, not at all clear. Might have been the idea of Ishtar translated into Germany. They do know that the name is very similar to other names in the Babylonian area, so it certainly would make some sense that it might have come from Ishtar, but it's not clear. So, and somehow what's also not clear is how did this get attached to Passover? How did that all happen? Nobody knows. almost certainly, and you know things happen like this, and we were just talking about things happen like this, is that she had a spring feast, and that would have been somewhere around the time of Passover, and things leak between these. If you don't keep bad things out of the church gets filled with bad things. And so these things from her fertility feast in the spring almost certainly were things that got into the old German church and that came into English and continued on. But it only happened in those languages, and that's interesting as well, because in English and German, they're the only ones that have an Easter for Passover. All the other Christian world uses the word Pascha. So Spanish, French, everybody is all using Pascha as the word that they use, and it's only German and English that use Easter. So that kind of does help us track it down, that it went down through Germanic roots and somehow came into Germanic, which isn't clear. So likely the spring feast for Easter came at the same time, and the ideas of fertility symbols got into there because people weren't able to keep it out. And it continued on that way, and so that's why we have rabbits and Easter eggs and all the rest of that stuff today. Any questions?
I think in Spanish is, I believe it's Pascua.
Is it? Okay.
Pascua.
I wouldn't know.
There's even,
I say guac.
oh, there's even men that are named Pascual.
Oh,
I don't
yeah?
know if that comes from that.
Okay. Yeah, what happened there was, as I said, the Aramaic name is Pascha, of course written in a different language, but it was translated phonetically into Greek, into Latin, and most other languages picked that up. And so all the other ways that they say it are very similar phonetically than that. They aren't translated as from their meaning. Passover, the English phrase, is the translation from meaning of Pascha. So you can do that translation two ways. You can do it based on its meaning or based on its sound. And so it was kept in most languages. I think all languages except except German and English. It was kept as Pascha. So anyway, that's likely how those things get in. But of course, there's very little documentation. Greek and Old English didn't have that many writings, not like the Greeks did. The Greeks wrote about everything and everybody read, and so there's a big culture of writing and reading, and so there's lots of things that we can find from their civilization, not so much about Old Germanic and Old English. So here we are in a time when the information age church knows about these things. It's possible for everybody to know all this, but they don't want to hear it. They make excuses because they don't want it. And so I found one from gotquestions.org. If you've ever been on that site, it's a theological apologetic site. And it says, even if it could be proved that the word Easter is etymologically related to the name of a pagan goddess such as Ishtar or Eostre, it would not change what the holiday Easter means to us.
Wow.
So they're saying, we don't care.
Yeah.
We've decided that it means this, and we don't care if it's full of rabbits and chicks and ducks and stuff. And you see that attitude everywhere. In the church that I was in before NHU, it was the same thing. I taught this lesson, and you can, if you think about it for even a moment, it says, boy, we're kind of on the wrong track here. Shouldn't we make a change? No interest in making a change. And so we see that here. In this whole article that was about Ishtar and whether that was Easter, not once does he give any concern about God. He never says, well, what does God think about this? That simply isn't in his focus at all. His focus is all about, well, we don't care. We're going to do it anyway. And so, again, we see that Roman idea of this is what we're going to do. We don't care what God thinks. We like what we're doing.
And they would say the exact same thing about Christmas.
Yeah.
That's the exact same thing. Even if it be proven about, it doesn't change what Christmas means to us. But, yeah.
Yeah, they're just going to keep on doing it. And so he says, we know what Easter really is, and so we don't care that the name might have come from Ishtar. But if you allow those things into the church, that does make a change in the church. And if you keep on allowing them in, and I've been in churches where they do have Easter eggs in the church and all of that stuff, rabbits and all the rest of it. And think, going back to Polycrates, he accused Rome of adding or taking away from the Bible because of a date change that they had made. The same thing is here, and we could accuse them of doing the same thing, of adding rabbits and chicks and all sorts of things to this celebration and changing the date as well. But they just don't care. Okay, again, going back to this idea of backdating, we're going to hit this one more time after this as well. Because when you've made changes that you can't support from the Bible, you have this kind of need to back them up and say, well, they said something in the Bible that means this, and we interpret it this way, and so what we're doing is perfectly justified. And one of those comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7 is really the focus verse here. I've highlighted in yellow. All sorts of people use this to justify their ideas about Passover. They use it to say that it's okay that the date of Passover changed because we're now in charge of Passover. We can do that if we want to. They say that it means that Passover doesn't exist anymore, and so it's okay for us to have our own feast. And so we're going to look at that a little bit and dig into what's being said there. And part of the problem is that what is said there isn't terribly clear. And in fact, it was Peter who talked about Paul that way. He says, our brother Paul writes about many things that are complicated and difficult to understand, and people twist them in all sorts of ways. And so whenever there's a passage in the Bible that isn't clear, that's an opportunity for someone to give their own meaning to it and to make it say something different. So this passage here I'll read through. I'm going to skip the part in yellow, and we'll come back to the part in yellow. So it says, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little yeast ferments the whole lump? Purge out the old yeast from you, that you would be a new lump, just as you are unleavened bread. Unleavened bread. Therefore, let us make a feast, not with the old yeast, neither with the yeast which is in wickedness or of bitterness, but with the yeast of purity and of holiness. So what we can see there is he's plainly talking about Passover, because he's been talking about unleavened bread, and Passover begins the feast of unleavened bread. And so what he's talking about there in saying your boasting is no good is he's talking about boasting being the yeast that can get into you, and once it gets into you, it ferments and spreads through the whole lump, is what he's saying. So we need to purge those things out, and that's a big part of what Passover is about. It's about that inspection of yourself, and Pastor dealt with that last week, is that one of the ways that we look at things is we look inside of ourselves to see if we have slipped away. And so that's what he's saying here, is purge out all of those things that might have gotten into you and become that unleavened bread, that pure bread that doesn't have any bad yeast in it. And it continues on saying, therefore, let's make a feast, not with the old yeast, neither with yeast of wickedness or bitterness, but with the yeast of purity and of holiness. So he's saying, purge out that bitterness, all those sorts of things that are the yeast that is inside of you, and become pure again. And purity and holiness is a big part of what Passover is about. So we can see that when we drop out that one little part of verse 7, that it's pretty clear what he's talking about. He's talking about becoming pure again and throwing out the things that have gotten into you, which, as we've seen with the Roman Church, is a message not just for people, but for a church as well. And so we look at this verse, or this part of the verse here that people have trouble with, and it says, our Passover is the Messiah who is slain for our sake. And that's not clear. What do you mean by that? Some people take that to mean that our Passover means that it's a different Passover. And some people say that our Passover means it can be whatever we want it to be, and therefore it's okay that the Romans did what they did. And so people read that and don't understand it well, and they make something out of it that it probably wasn't intended to be. So the question is Paul saying that the Messiah is a new feast to replace Passover? Well, that whole passage, when you look at the context of it, doesn't seem to be saying that. The whole passage is really about throwing out the yeast, the evil yeast that's in you, and bringing in a yeast of purity and holiness instead. And that's tied to the Passover season. And so he seems to be saying that it's all about purity and holiness and not boasting and not other things. And he says whatever yeast you have in you will be what spreads and envelops you. And so he started out by saying your boasting is no good. And so he's saying that boasting is yeast inside of you. And if you allow it to, it's going to continue to spread and ferment and cover all through you. So I dug into that in a number of different places, and most translations don't amplify that section of that verse. They don't try to make it any clearer than it is. they just translate it in a little different ways. One of them says, "For Christ, our Passover lamb has been sacrificed." Another one says, "For even Christ, our Passover is sacrificed for us." Another one says, "Christ, God's lamb, has been slain for us." So there's a general understanding that it's talking about a Passover lamb, and that Jesus is that lamb who is slain for us. This one from Phillips, the fourth bullet point there, is a bit of a paraphrase. And I'm not always comfortable with paraphrases. But this one says, "We Christians have had a Passover lamb sacrificed for us, none other than Christ himself, so let us keep the feast." So that's how they see it, what it means. And the verse that comes after 5:7 is pretty much always in all translations begins with, "Therefore let us keep the feast." And so they're talking about the Passover feast as being a specific feast here. And so I went to the Message, which is a really strong paraphrase. I don't almost ever quote from the Message because I'm not comfortable with any translator having the ability to put in their own ideas. But in this case, I think he's got the right idea. And so he translates that little piece of 5:7 into this. He says, "The Messiah, our Passover lamb, has already been sacrificed for the Passover meal, and we are the unbraised bread part of the feast. So let's live out our part in the feast." So he's saying because the Messiah, our Passover lamb, has already been sacrificed, then that part of the feast is already there for us to partake of, and we are the unleavened bread part of that feast, and therefore we need to do our part to be part of that feast. So digging into the weeds of that verse, but the idea generally is that when there are difficult parts in the Bible to read, people often find those as a refuge to bring in their own ideas. Okay, other related days. The Roman Catholic Church didn't just change Passover. They introduced a whole bunch of other things. And all along, they had been adding new days to that. The observance of the Christian calendar was filled up with Roman Catholic days. We know about All Saints' Day, although we call it Halloween now, but that's one of the many that they created. It was originally created to commemorate Christian martyrs who had died. And we know about Lent and Ash Wednesday. I'll talk about those a bit more in a moment. And there were many other days that they created that most Protestant-based or non-Catholic groups don't know anything about. But I want to say that a church is in decline when it begins to focus on physical things like that. When your focus turns to fancy clothes for elders, fancy buildings for churches, positions of authority within the church, who's the pope, who's the bishop, all that sort of stuff. When you start to focus on actions that people have to take, like crossing themselves, and words that they have to say, and things that they have to do, and specific prayers you have to pray, and there's lots of observances like that, you've started to turn away to physical things, and you've started to leave behind what are the God things, the spiritual things. And we see that so much in the Roman Catholic Church, and less so in other churches. But whenever a church begins to make that change of focusing on physical things, they've started to turn away from spiritual things.
One physical thing that comes to mind is when they pray with a rosary. You know, I don't know exactly what it means, but all the little beads, they have to say a prayer or something.
Yeah, there are two kinds of beads. One of them is every 10th bead, I think it is. Does anyone know all this stuff? And yeah, there's a prayer associated with each bead.
Yes.
And so you're re-praying static prayers over and over and over and over again. Now imagine you had a friend who would come up to you and say the exact same thing every time.
When they pray the rosary.
It's like 10 Holy Marys.
Yeah, the
and
10 Hail Marys, yes.
Yeah.
And you hear them,
Did you hear?
like they did at funerals or whatever, the Hail Marys, and so for each bead they have to say it, they say it and then they say a few other words. It's different after each Hail Mary, but the Hail Mary is a specific thing. And if you've ever been like a rosary for someone like at a funeral, the priest says it so fast you can't hear what he's saying because he has to get through it. Hail Mary, I mean, you cannot understand what he's saying. They usually mumble it in a low voice, and they just say it super quick. And then afterwards, then they have a specific prayer for beating the rule. And then after that, Hail Mary, and it's like, I've been on like, I can't even understand what the guy's saying. He's mumbling and saying it so quickly.
Yeah, and that just naturally happens.
When you're saying the same thing over and over and over, after a while you just like,
And you start saying it really fast.
You know that in Islam they do the same thing.
Oh, yes.
They have a
Yeah, Islam is very much a works-based thing, so you have the same kind of ideas of things you have to do, observances, they have to pray 5 times a day, all sorts of things like that. When you start to see that coming, that's a problem for a church. Okay, I see that I've burned up lots of time here. We're going to have to continue. We'll pick up with Lent next week and get back to it then. We're close to the end now.